Hi, my name is Dr. Antoinette Vicks, and I will be your chair today. My co-chair is Dr. Elizabeth Cruson, excuse me. We're both full-time faculty here at UAGC in the Department of Behavioral Sciences. And we are very pleased to welcome to you your presenter today, who is Dr. Adrienne Miller. And she will be speaking on providing a trauma-informed, responsive environment. So without further ado, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Let me share here. Get this going. Hopefully. There we go. All right, can everybody see the first screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sometimes I need the verbal because I can't see anybody. All right, everybody. So today I am presenting on providing a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive environment. And of course, this is our wonderful Culture of Care Summit, and I'm hoping to empower you with not only information for yourself, but to be able to share with others. So today we are going to discuss, let me go back, sorry. There we go. The definition of trauma and what it does to the body and brain. SAMHSA's which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration's 4 key elements and 6 principles of being trauma informed, which is also going to give us action items that help us to move from being trauma informed to trauma responsive. I also want to let everybody know, because we are discussing trauma, please take care of yourself. If at any time you feel uncomfortable and you need to walk away, turn off the volume, even turn this off completely, it's okay. I completely understand, and that is all right. That is what we are here for. That's what being trauma informed is. This is me. I am a UAGC associate faculty. I teach here part-time, as well as other hats in my life. But I just wanted to put that up there so you could see me. So if you have, maybe this will work, maybe. Let's see. Okay, so if you have other computer screen or your phone, and you can log on to menti.com and you can put in the code at the top. I want to see, hopefully this will work. What do you think trauma is? This will hopefully bring up a word cloud as we get started here. It can be action, feeling, hyphenated word, an event. And so I'm hoping we'll see something come up here in a second. If not, perhaps we get something in the chat, but I'm hoping this will work first. I tried it earlier and it worked. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Yes, absolutely. Pain, impact to well-being, assault of some kind. Yes, it can be that. Anything else? Painful, pain, hurt, damaging, emotional, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Awesome. All right. These are all wonderful. And it tells me that we do have an idea of what this is going on, what's going on. PTSD, absolutely negative. Yes. All right, so I'm going to move on, but these are wonderful, wonderful responses. Hopefully I'm going to move on. There we go. So researchers have come together and they've come up with this definition broken down, that trauma can be first or secondhand. So you can witness it, or if you hear someone talk about trauma over and over and over again, you can actually develop trauma from that. It's called vicarious or secondhand trauma. It can be you yourself or a group experience. So an example of a group experience would be when you ask people, remember 9/11? And everybody sort of pauses and you all get this feeling. It looks different individually, but if you were there on that day, you remember where you were, you remember what happened, you remember how you were feeling. It can be a one-time incident or repeated incidents. And it definitely has lasting negative effects. And we also call this toxic stress. There is positive stress, believe it or not. So this might be when you are packing for a vacation, which is flurried and frenzy and stressful, but it's sort of a happy stress. Like, oh my goodness, we're going to get out of here. We're going to go. This is crazy right now, but we know something good is going to happen. There's also negative stress that's not lasting. So for example, when you have a newborn baby and they're crying all the time and you don't get enough sleep and it's stressful, but it doesn't last and it's not toxic. So these are the components of what scientists say constitutes trauma, and they've taken them a lot from the definition of PTSD, the clinical definition. So we're going to break down trauma right here so we can see who experiences trauma, what does a trauma event look like, and how does that play out? What are the symptoms to the actual body and the brain? So first, the who. First, we're going to look at children, 0 to 17, because unfortunately, this has the biggest impact. This is brain development period, this is attachment period, and the first real study on this happened a while ago. It happened in 1998. Dr. Felitti had this group of people who he was running a weight loss group, and they were very successful, and they would go away for 6 months, a year, and they kept coming back, gaining all this weight. And the insurance company was like, why is this happening? And he's like, I have no idea. So they did this huge study with 17,000 people, and they found these similar characteristics among these 17,000 people, which were adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which you might have heard, that all happened before the age of 18. And you can see them to the left of the dotted line. They were broken up into the categories of abuse, neglect, and household challenges with a parent, caregiver, or other adult. And what happens is these are the 10 questions that were on a questionnaire eventually. You can see these in usually a clinical setting, or often in a foster care setting if you want to see ACEs, sometimes a pediatrician office. And these have big effects on children and their development. As more research has come along, while Dr. Felitti's research was foundational, more research has found that these items to the right, bullying, community violence, natural disasters, refugee wartime experience, and witnessing or experiencing acts of terrorism, have the exact same effect as the original ACEs. And so they've been added to this list. And so we have questionnaires that are called expanded ACEs questionnaires or surveys that can be given out. And who has ACEs? Unfortunately, a lot of us have ACEs. In Dr. Felitti's study, it turns out that 61% of individuals, or 2/3, had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 6 had 4 or more, which is not great. And so this is what comes out of having ACEs. The more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likelihood you are to have injuries, mental health concerns, maternal health concerns, chronic diseases. And in this chronic disease category, I would actually add heart issues, lupus, Crohn's disease. There's more chronic diseases that fall into this category than this infographic has. You also have a higher chance of risky behavior, and you lose opportunities. And I'm going to show you why. So I have these infographics, but I'm really going to show you why here in a little bit. So in the original study with Dr. Felitti, you can imagine you have a weight loss group. This group, even though it's huge, 17,000 individuals, were mostly white, middle to upper class individuals. And so as research expanded, what we found was when we look at groups of lower socioeconomic status, minorities, LGBTQ, they have higher ACEs. usually 4 or more. Also, when we look at groups that are in juvenile justice and foster care, 70% have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. But I want to give you a little bit of hope. So in 2019, the American Journal of Medicine for Pediatrics had a study of what they call PACEs. And they found that one positive supportive relationship in childhood makes a huge difference and can do away with these effects, can lower these effects. Everything that you saw on the previous slide, all of these are reduced if you have one supportive, positive relationship in your childhood. And so that's why it's so important to have someone in the life of a child. So I'll just give you some positive news there. So we're going to move on a little bit. And if you're over 18, this is what, your trauma experiences are looking like. And I do want to talk about survival. So survival on here is, couch surfing, not knowing where your next meal is coming from, not having that stability, that Maslow's hierarchy of needs on the bottom as an adult. And so these are the items that you would have. They're not ACEs because you're over 18, but if you think about it as a 17-year-old moving to an 18-year-old the next day, you're still going to have the same issues from one day to another. And if you have had ACEs, it's going to look very different at 18 or older than if you had a loving, supportive childhood and had no ACEs whatsoever. You're going to have that fully developed brain and attachment that's going to handle it a little differently with some trauma. All right, we're going to get into what I call the meat here of trauma and the brain. And so if you look here, and I'm going to give you a little action item. If you hold your fist up, your hand up, and you tuck your thumb in, and then roll your fingers over top. So it almost looks like a fist, but you have your thumb tucked inside. So the arm that goes up is the brainstem, sort of looking at the brain on the screen. And then tucked inside your thumb here are all the pieces that your brain has for survival that were created first. So they help you breathe, they send messages to pump your heart. This is where adrenaline rush comes from. And then after that's formed, then the brain grows upward to the top, outward to the top, and then forward. And so to the front is the executive functioning, the prefrontal cortex, that is not completely developed until you're about early to mid-20s. And this is where logical thinking, rational decision-making, the consequence thinking, the what will happen if I do this, should I not say that because this might happen, should I not do that because this might happen, planning and thinking ahead, that's where all that is housed. Last thing to develop. That's why your teens don't always make the best decisions. But here's the problem. Not even a problem, but here's what happens when you have a trauma event. So if we start at the top, we have a trauma event, and the body and the brain, which are these great functioning, perfect machines. The brain says, oh no, we need to survive. So they send out oxytocin, which sends out a message to the body. We turn on adrenaline. We get ready to fight, flight, or freeze. We're going to do whatever we can to survive because this is a trauma event. It's huge. It also shuts down the unnecessary systems to survive because all we're going to do is think about living and surviving. What shuts down? Well, your prefrontal cortex, where all the decision making, that shuts down. Your digestive system shuts down. Your endocrine system, sweat glands, all this shuts down. And because adrenaline is pumping, your heart is racing because it's pushing out all the blood to your body, to your extremities. Whether you need to fight, whether you need to run, you have everything that you need to live, to survive, because it's a well-oiled machine. So whatever happens, happens. The event passes. Your brain says, okay, we're done. Cortisol is released. It acts kind of like fire extinguisher foam. And the body starts turning down to baseline. Systems turn back off, back on, and everything comes back. But here's the issue. If you have multiple adverse childhood experiences or multiple trauma events that occur regularly, the body and the brain say, we need to be aware. We need to be hypervigilant because we're very often worried about surviving. So it doesn't make sense to go completely back to baseline because it takes longer to get back into survival mode, and survival is really important. So we're just not going to go back to baseline or completely back to baseline after a while. And if it happens often, then it doesn't go back to baseline, maybe a little bit. Then the next time, even more, not further away from baseline. And it keeps going. So over time, the body has the heart going not at a low blood pressure, not at a low speed. You have digestive systems that are not functioning properly because they're half shut off. You have endocrine systems that are not functioning properly because they're half shut off. See where I'm going with this? This is why, you have those health issues that we were looking at earlier, and why you have the more ACEs, you end up with those long-term issues. Same thing with the prefrontal cortex. If you have ACEs and you're a child, the neural pathways, granted your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, but those pathways are still being formed to get there, and they're developing and you're learning because you're in school doing problems and thinking and comprehension tests to get there. And so they're going offline. They're taking that away so that you can survive. Van der Kolk, which is a resource I want to share with you, Vissel van der Kolk wrote a book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is where most of this information comes from. It's written so you can understand it. I highly recommend it. And he showed through MRIs, looking at the brain and the brain's reaction, that every time you have a trigger, so not the actual event, but when an event happens, something happens with your five senses. So you either see something, hear something, smell something that's going on at that time. And later, if you see, hear, smell that exact same thing, you get a trauma because it's, going back in your brain, and your brain acts as though that trauma event is happening in real time. So it's not far away like a memory, but the brain goes, that same thing's happening again. We need to go into survival mode. And so it all comes back together into this same cycle. This happens a lot with kids in school, believe it or not. So think about those kiddos who, they're hyper aware, they're hypersensitive, something happens, teacher says, hey, are you okay? And all of a sudden, maybe they're yelling, they're angry, they're flailing out, and nobody knows what just happened. So think about this kind of thing when you're thinking about trauma-informed. How does this look different now, knowing this information? Okay, so I just threw a lot of information out there. I'm going to process this just for a second. So I'm going to go kind of slow on this side so we can think about this before we move on to the next section. Foundations of trauma. So first, this is how we get to trauma responsive. First, we learn about the reactions and importance of trauma. Done. That's what we just did. Now that we know what trauma is, how everything reacts, we can understand what's going on and start thinking about things differently. And we do that by becoming self-aware. How are we thinking? So this idea, this shift of, instead of thinking what's wrong with you, what happened to you? And that's a big key part of being trauma informed. What happened? What happened out there? This awareness that we need to have is pretty constant, considering we're looking at 3/4 of the population has probably had an adverse childhood experience and may be having trauma in their adulthood. Taking that information and moving forward into being trauma responsive is taking that awareness and moving it into action and showing that we have that awareness in what we say and what we do. And I also want to give you a couple resources as we move towards being trauma responsive. Not able to really use them here, but I just want to put them out there so that you have that to think about. One is the University of Buffalo's Center for Social Research, and they have the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. They just made this whole big long name. It used to be like a trauma toolkit. This is a wonderful website. They have how to be trauma informed, how to make your workplace trauma informed, how to change all your policies and procedures. It's just this huge library, and they're very responsive if you reach out and have any questions. The other is what we're going to look at today, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's Concept of Trauma and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. And so before we dive into that, I want to just preface this with there's 6 principles. They kind of overlap. This document is about 10 years old, but it is foundational, and every other trauma-informed research document guidance comes off of this. It is based on mental health and substance use, but it is made generically and generally so that it does translate through other items.
Adrian, someone is asking you about what website?
Oh, the website is, let me say it again because it's long. So if you Google the University at Buffalo's Center for Social Research, they have an Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. So if you just Google the University of Buffalo and type trauma-informed, it'll bring you right there. This is coming from SAMHSA's document. They have 4 key R's, they call them, key assumptions on a trauma-informed approach. So this is kind of what we know to be true in order to be trauma-informed. So first we realize that the impact of trauma is huge, and that there are paths out there to success. And we did learn this, 2/3 to 3/4 of the population has had an adverse childhood experience. Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. So based on what we learned about the brain, and knowing that we're going into fight, flight, or freeze mode, you may see zoning out, you may see anger, you may see crying, you may see withdrawal, you may see constant hypervigilance. So this is what's to be aware of. Responding by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practice. And actively avoiding re-traumatization. So if you read the document, the R is resisting re-traumatization. I don't like that word because it sounds like we're trying to re-traumatize people. Knowing that trauma is out there and that it comes from the 5 senses means that it's fairly unpredictable. And so understanding this means we are going to do what we can to control what we can, and then use our trauma-informed self to react appropriately and in an understanding way. Okay. So getting into the 6 principles, again, these are going to kind of overlap as we go along, and they're meant to, because being trauma-informed is, it's holistic. So the first is safety. And of course, physical safety, we think, the generally physical safety, no violence, everything's lit, we're good. But this also means a feeling of physical safety. So if you're hypersensitive, hyper aware, and you're in an office, let's say, and there's lots of things on the walls, lots of different colors, lots of different sounds, maybe banging, and there's a window in the office that you're sitting in, and people are walking by constantly. Maybe they're knocking on the window. Maybe the window to the outside has things that are going on. It's just going to be very overwhelming. And so that's something to be considered about. Also, in a virtual environment, if you have a virtual background, consider not using ones with movement. They're great, absolutely. They're cute, they're wonderful. But if you have things flying here, there, and the other, it just may be very overwhelming and distracting for someone, especially if they've had a lot of trauma and they're hyper aware of things. Emotional safety. So, emotional safety, if we're being trauma informed, it means that we are presenting ourselves, we are non-judgmental, we are genuine, we are listening, we are using positive language. We're generally positive, but we're using positive language. So, for example, instead of the word victim, we're going to use terms like survivor. We're using empathy. And I love Brené Brown's YouTube video on sympathy versus empathy. I didn't have enough time to put it here, but the general idea is sympathy comes with a but. So, I'm sorry that happened to you, but you're okay now. Oh, that's really awful. But at least, it's a good day outside. That's sympathy. Empathy is, I'm sorry that happened to you. And you just let it go. You leave space. You're validating the feeling. You're allowing that feeling to be there, and it's a safe space. This happened this past week, and I'm glad it did because it's a perfect example of trauma-informed physical and emotional safety in a virtual world. I don't know if you guys saw Steve Burns from Blue's Clues got to the internet and had a beautiful trauma-informed moment where he just said, "Hey, I'm checking in, how you doing?" And he left some time and nodded and said, "Okay," and said, "You look good." And the background was very plain, and he just gave space, and it was wonderful. Guys, if there's any questions I need to address in the chat, please let me know.
You're good.
Okay, good. Trustworthiness and transparency. This is interesting from a professional perspective because sometimes we are bound by rules in a professional capacity, but we can still do these things. So ethically, we have to follow confidentiality, but we can be upfront about that and what that entails. We can be upfront about the guidelines in our conversation. So, hey, I'm here for you. Let me know what I can do. Let me know if you want to talk. But also know if you tell me certain things, I have to tell somebody else because your safety is important. So we can be very upfront with that. That's the transparency. We have to be able to have difficult discussions. So if something bad has happened, have the difficult discussion. Be upfront. That's trustworthiness. Don't gloss over it. Be factual. Be unbiased. Tell the truth. All the details as they need to be out there. And be making sure that you use language that is understandable instead, as professionals, oftentimes we use acronyms or we pull in other terms and ideas. But remember, if there's trauma, that executive functioning is not always the way it should be. And so we need to be able to make sure that we're being understood and that the concepts that we're talking about are understood as well, just because that's part of the trustworthiness piece. We're not leading you astray. We're not telling you things that you don't understand, and you may want to check in. Does that make sense? Do you understand? So that you know that they're getting the information that they need. Because if not, then that's not trustworthiness. Peer support. So remember, this document was written from a mental health substance use approach, but this is absolutely appropriate outside of that world. When you talk to those who have had trauma, and this one study asked a group of people with trauma the importance of having a group of peers or talking to peers and why that was important. The quote, I'm going to read the quote, is that the world is not ready for our stories. So the feeling is that these stories are too much for those that haven't experienced trauma. They don't understand. We can have empathy and we can feel that pain, but we just don't understand. And so peer support brings in sense making, bridging the identity of past and present self, because there's this idea of what we should be and what the world thinks we should be, but we really don't know what that is. And so being with others, the questions and the emotions are familiar, and it normalizes what has happened. Principle 4, yes.
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Principle 4, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. I love that quote. Decision making is shared. If we are in a group, get all the feedback from everybody. And if feedback is used, great. If feedback is not used, let that person know why the decision was made differently. Keeping them in the loop is very trauma-informed. There's a great idea of don't talk about me without me. And so we definitely want to keep that as much as possible. Trauma takes away choices, takes away power. Choices, limited choices, give back power, because sometimes choices can be overwhelming when we don't have that executive functioning. When you give choices, make sure both choices, A and B, are possible and appropriate. Give space to function in the way that is possible. Be there for support. That's called a capability space. Hey, I'm just checking in. How's it going? So they know you're not hovering, but you're there if needed. Know that functioning may not be linear. Executive thinking may not be linear. So be willing to go off script and know that baby steps are good steps. They're celebratory, and any way movement is good. Acknowledgement of these issues, past and present. These do exist. Again, this is awful. I'm so sorry. What can I do is a great trauma-informed action. Solution. Hey, I know of a program. I know of a referral. I know of a place we can go that's going to help, I don't know, do whatever. That is the trauma response here. Equity versus equality. I love this graphic because I think it explains the difference, equality and equity, so much better, because they sound similar, but equality is giving the same to everybody, and equity is giving everybody what they need. And I think that's just a beautiful way to show this. And so lastly, before we take off and I open up for questions, I wanted to share these quotes after this discussion, especially learning about the brain and shutting down what it does to the body, what we can do to be trauma-informed and what trauma-informed looks like. And hopefully this leaves you with a little bit of hope and a little bit of an idea of what you can do and what a difference you can make. And so I did want to open it up at this point for questions, thoughts, comments.
Someone put a question in. It says, what if I were to say I may have a solution, leaves room for ideas and suggestions versus I have a solution?
Absolutely. you can, and asking questions is very trauma informed. So you can say, what do you think about this idea? Or what do you think about this versus this? And so that gives them a choice. Or does this sound like it's a better idea than this? Because again, that idea of we don't know because we haven't walked the path, or we don't know exactly how it feels to a person's specific situation. So absolutely, that is a perfect example. Did anybody see the Steve Burns online or the reaction? The reactions were amazing. Everybody felt so good and so heard. And he literally said, I think, 3 sentences.
While I do want to take the time, just a moment, while everyone is thanking you and thinking of additional questions, I do want to officially thank you and ask that everyone else thanks you for your time and for your insight, and to let everyone know we are coming up on the end of this session of providing a trauma-informed responsive environment. Liz has already placed information into the chat box for the next upcoming sessions, so you are free to click on those if you want to join another session. And on behalf of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and the University of Arizona Global Campus, we want to thank you and hope that everyone has a fantastic remainder of the day. And we appreciate your attendance in the session and hope that hopefully you learned something that was insightful and beneficial to you moving forward.